turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
I've been watching Love is Blind. The entire time I was watching it, I'm like, what would bell hooks think about this nightmare? Like, everyone in that show is just like, this is an experiment. This love is an experiment. And they all fall in love with each other within like 24 hours, and they get engaged within like 2 weeks, and then married the next month.
Is it like real marriage, or is it just like for the cameras? Like, it's officially binding.
Yeah.
Oh, in 2 weeks.
But it's all these shows like Naked Attraction as well. You see each other naked. I've only watched it a couple times, I think. Maybe more. I don't know, I'm joking.
There's also the more exploitative evil cousin, which is 90 Day Fiancé.
I've heard of this.
So it is basically visa marriages. So people, they're like, we've known each other online. Then they come to their country and they're like, we're going to get married. And it's always low key, like, I want an American citizenship visa, baby. Like, let's go. And they have 90 days to like see if they work out or not. And then they apply for that visa and then they get married. It's bad.
I've seen like clips of it, but I don't think I've ever like sat to watch a whole episode. But I've seen like clips on Twitter.
It's absolute garbage. Like, you lose brain cells actively while watching it, and it's my, like, shut down brain thing. I don't have to think. I just stare at my phone and listen.
So I wonder what bell hooks would say about that.
I'm going to channel her spirit, because I watched an NPR interview from 2000 when the book first came out, and she talks about how she's watching sitcoms where they're just there for fast-paced laughs. And I think, really, this would just go back to what she says, is that, you know, we live in a loveless society. I think she would just look at all of this and be like, have you learnt nothing from my book? She was quite witty in her interviews, etc. And I feel like she had a sharp wit and she was very critical, but I think she'd also like have an in-joke with us and just be like, come on, girl, is this love? Do you want a loveless life? So I watched a clip recently where she talked about the fact that she was investing in real estate. And she said, girl, get your money right, or something like that. And I was like, get your money straight. And I was like, okay, Belle. I was like, I see you, Bell Hooks. I see who you are.
Me and Paula were looking at, like, when you go on Twitter and you type in bell hooks, number one she's getting hate for is for being a landlord. Like, people are just hating.
Yeah, like, her ownership of land in the city of Manhattan is highly contested.
Bell Hooks was an auntie. I feel like she's one of those aunties that's like, you know, like those aunties that you could tell there was a time where their politics was so radical. Like, they were the rebel of their like generation. But it's like, as the times has moved on and we've all learned like so much stuff and like all of that, it's almost like she has then not regressed, but it's like she hasn't caught up with everyone else and the times and stuff.
When I was reading the book, I was like, is she from the South? And then I looked it up and she's from the South. And I was like, this makes sense.
Sue, if you just introduce yourself. So, yeah, who are you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Lemos. I'm a PhD student at the University of Warwick in the history department. I've stuck around Warwick for a very, very long time. I started my undergrad in 2014, and I'm currently undertaking a PhD in history on the community and political organising of queer Black people and people of colour in late 20th century Britain. So it's kind of a focus on thinking about the historical roots of queer Black politics in Britain and how that speaks to kind of longer trajectories of liberation politics since the New Left, so 1950s, 1960s, and kind of what happened in the 1990s with the rise of queer and bisexual politics and transgender politics.
Awesome. Adebayo, if you have a little introduction to you as well.
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Adebayo Quadry-Adekanbi. I am also a PhD student at Warwick in sociology. I'm researching the intersectional politics of queer activism and feminism in Nigeria. So looking at how queer people are mobilizing despite being criminalized by the state. And I'm currently in Lagos, Nigeria, actually. So shout out, Giddy. Yeah.
And Sue and Adebayo are joining us today to talk about Bell Hooks' All About Love, New Visions, which is the first of 3 books that Hooks does in this kind of series. We just double checked. I believe it was out in 1999, but it might be 2000. We'll see. But Adebayo, you're going to give us a little introduction to Bell Hooks, aren't you?
I am. Okay, so Gloria Jean Watkins. No, okay, so not many people know this, but her name was not Bell Hooks. It was Gloria Jean Watkins. That was her real name, okay? She was born in September 25th, 1952, and she died on December 15th, 2021. She was born in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, USA, and her real name, like I said, was Gloria Jean Watkins, not Bell Hooks. So Bell Hooks is the name of her maternal great-grandmother. I don't know if anyone's noticed this, but Bell Hooks is always spelled in lowercase. And that was purposeful. It was basically to focus the attention on her message and not on her as a person, which was an interesting choice because it was, in fact, because it was lowercase, was why I was interested in who the person was. And before I state the next fact, what was everyone doing at the age of 19? Like, just very quickly around the room, what were you doing at 19?
I was having a lot of fun. And I was an engineering student.
Oh my goodness, same.
Yeah, but you finished yours. I dropped out.
Oh.
At 19, I was in my second year of chemical engineering and trying desperately to get money to leave the state of Florida. Yeah.
No, I was in my second year of uni, but I had basically almost just failed. No, I did fail the first year of uni, but they let me through. So I was going into my second year of uni not knowing if I wanted to be there. So yeah. Sue.
And you're still here, Hannah, thankfully. Yeah. I was always oldest in my year, so I just started uni. And I was really disappointed that I was starting uni because I didn't get into my first choice. So it was that sort of existential crisis you get, which now really doesn't matter. And that was it. Yeah, I was moving to the Midlands. So it was like a big shock for me coming from London, but it was great.
Well, I don't remember what I was doing at 19, to be perfectly honest, and I don't know why I asked you guys to tell me that. But at 19, she was writing her first full-length book, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. I know, yeah, that's who she was. And she wrote over 30 books in her lifetime. And she apparently hand-wrote those books, with her hand and a pen and paper, allegedly.
We read that last night and we were like, that's crazy.
Wild. Another really interesting fact about Bell Hooks that just always makes me giggle and chuckle a little bit is her referring to Beyonce as a terrorist and anti-feminist. And this was in relation to her discussing Beyonce's Times cover. So this was the 2014 Times cover, and she refers to Beyonce, and I quote, "I see a part of Beyonce that is in fact anti-feminist and is a terrorist, especially in terms of the impact on young girls." But yeah, Bell Hooks was really, really down with pop culture. No, I don't know if you'd say really, really down, but she was relatively down with pop culture. So she did an interview with Lil Kim in 1997 for the cover of Paper Magazine, which is another really interesting article. And she talks about that in the book, actually. So those are some of the things and little tidbits about Bell Hooks. Oh, she had no partner, allegedly. So in 2017, she had an interview with Abigail Berriola, and she said she had no partner and she had been celibate for 17 years.
I also am not sure, just to add, but I read this on Wikipedia, so it could be fake. But apparently she was Buddhist Christian. That's what she said she was. Okay, people are not. That was true. I think this is also relevant information for, especially when she's discussing spirituality and the soul and all of that stuff. But yeah. Sue, can we have an overview of the book?
Oh, yes. Most definitely you can. I mean, I'm going to give you a bit of a pseudo intellectual history. So I think most of us here will remember that the book kind of re-emerged during the lockdown around 2020. So I think that's interesting. This had kind of this re-emergence, and there's the kind of 2018 edition that comes out, and that's actually currently number 3 on the paperback non-fiction list of the New York Times bestsellers list. And then All About Love is actually part of a love trilogy called Love Song to the Nation. And the second book is Salvation, Black People and Love, first published in 2001. And it explores different views of love and mainly focuses on different Black figures in contemporary society, which is contemporaneous to the book, and then in Black history. So she focuses a bit on legacy of slavery, relationships, and she draws on the writing of Martin Luther King. James Baldwin, and Maya Angelou. I haven't actually read the book, so that's all I can really tell you about it. But I think it's interesting, and I think just give out shout outs to these books, so then you can think about maybe how these three books intertwine, like what's the broader kind of message he's trying to say about love. And then the third book, the final book, is Communion, The Female Search for Love, which was first published in 2002. And that explored the impact of the feminist movement, women's change in role and participation in the labour market, and the culture of self-help books on women and love. Which is interesting because in All About Love, she draws on the feminist movement and she draws a lot on self-help books, some of them written by psychologists. I wasn't familiar with a lot of the books. Some of them I looked up as I was reading. So she seems to be very fascinated with self-help books. I'm wondering maybe she just drew on them in her own life. She was a voracious reader. And I think what's interesting is that, like, Bell Hooks was the type of person, of course, who wanted to add to the intro, who would come out with 2 books in 1 year, publish 2 books in 1 year. That's amazing. I just can't imagine someone doing that. But Bell Hooks can and could. So if we just think of this first, because I think basically her kind of treatise on love, like her kind of introduction being like, this is her philosophy of love, but it's not as prescriptive as that. It's her beginning a conversation. And then the other 2 books, I guess she's unpacking these 2 themes. That's what I'm imagining right now without having read the other 2 books. And the book, aside from a preface and introduction, is comprised of 13 chapters/essays that explore different themes. So, of course, the first chapter, which we will talk about later, outlines her central conceit about love, that love is a verb. And I won't give away too much because I want us to have a joint conversation about that. And then the other essay/chapters, and I think essay is an interesting way to think of it, as a collection of essays, focus on childhood, spirituality and Christianity, romantic love, friendship, the family or familial relationships, and living in capitalism and in a consumerist society. And she's mainly drawing on her experiences of living in the US or being American. And those aren't all discrete themes, they overlap and intertwine. I just wanted to say a little tidbit about the backstory to the book. I listened to an interview from NPR where she was interviewed in 2000. And she mentioned that the book was actually inspired by conversations with an ex-boyfriend about love. So that's interesting, considering that in 2017, she said she didn't have a partner anymore. And she said that they had completely different views of love, completely different views. She was from the boomer generation and he was from the born in 30-something generation. Well, that's what she referred to it as. After that conversation, I was just kind of thinking about the fact that she was surprised how many people didn't know how to define love. And also from her engagement with popular culture, Bell Hooks loved to use popular culture to really relate to people and convey more complex messages, but from a medium that everyone could engage with. She said that movies and television kind of tell us that love is a mystery. And so she really wants, I guess, demystify love through this book. And finally, which she mentions, of course, in this book as well, is that the civil rights movement in the US taught us that love is a transformative power. It politicized love. And I think that's very important, is that her definition of love is really moving away from a emotional kind of affective view of love. When I say affect, I'm talking about emotion here and feeling. To think about love as also a political project, something that animates both our private lives and our public lives.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to kind of do a question before we go deep into the chapters. And just up top, we're covering chapter 1, Clarity, Give Love Words. Chapter 4, Commitment, Let Love Be Love in Me. Chapter 8, Community, Loving Communion. And chapter 13, Destiny, When Angels Speak of Love. But before we get into those, a question that we had when we discussed this previously was, how did Hooks challenge, change, or make you think about your own ideas of love, and kind of what is your relationship to this text? So I first read this book, I think it was the end of 2020. So it was in that, was it the second lockdown of the pandemic? I can't remember. It was the one that went over the winter period in the UK. But I had just moved away from home and I was house sitting in an extended period for somebody else, and I was by myself. It was the first time properly reading this, and I had been through some really difficult times, so I was in a very vulnerable state, I guess. And when I tell you this book was extremely transformative, you know, the journey of healing and coming to terms with yourself and your family and the way you build relationships is always, I don't think it's like a thing you just do and then you move on. It's a thing that happens over time. So I wouldn't say this journey is at an end, but this was, I would say, like one of those key moments for me. So it was really transformative, at least for me. It was also very difficult to read. There's a chapter we didn't read, which is the second chapter, all about family and parental relationships. And it was a very difficult chapter for me to read. But actually, going back and reading the book again, I think I'm just at a different place in my life. And I've done a lot of healing emotionally. And so it wasn't quite as difficult. It didn't hit as much. And I didn't expect that. And I also want to say that just finally, the idea, and we can go into it in the chapter 1, but this idea of a love being a verb as something you do and something more active rather than something that's just there, that was a very transformative idea for me. So yeah, that was my thoughts, feelings. Yeah, who wants to go next?
I think now I can go. Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think it was like very similarly to yourself. I also discovered it during lockdown. I think mine was like 2020 into 2021 lockdown, so that winter period as well. Very similarly, I was also isolated in Coventry. But yeah, like so I was like stuck in Coventry, locked down there, and I think I was also like going through a very transformative, I would say, journey in regards to my relationship with myself, my relationship with loving myself, but also my relationship with my family. And so like it was a very interesting time discovering it. And I think, like you say, Hannah, like reading it at different times evokes different emotions, but also you see the book differently depending on where you are when you read it. Because like reading the book back now as to where I am and the place I am, I genuinely do feel like I've outgrown the book a little bit because there's parts that I'm just like, well, I get it, but I feel like I've moved past this. And I mean, it's a good thing that I guess the book helped me when it did, and for the time when it was supposed to, it did the job that it needed to do. But I think it's also like I've very quickly realized that it didn't need to be the start and the end of your journey understanding and conceptualizing love. Yeah, for me, it was just very, very helpful in regards to helping me conceptualize how to love myself. But also, I think a very big part of it was understanding the relationship between love and forgiveness and how that really does intersect with, you know, love for yourself, love for your family, and all of that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I had a similar experience to both of you. When I read it when it had its resurgence around 2020, I remember thinking it was like a light bulb moment, or there were fireworks in my head. And I was like, yeah, this is how I want to live. Because I'm always talking about how I'm really upset that we live in such an individualist society, especially in the UK, right? And also just the work culture as well, etc. Like, because even in the rest of the continent of Europe, there'll be people kind of will criticize the UK for its work culture. It's like fast-paced work culture, especially coming from London. But with that, it's how you relate to people, right? And I think the book kind of reminded me that there is a point to wanting to aspiring to an idea of community and society where you care about one another and their spiritual growth, as bell hooks would say. So it validated a lot for me, and it gave me some language there, because I'd been thinking about it, but I hadn't read a text like that. And then rereading it now, and I think this is the third time I've read from some of it. I haven't read the whole book 3 times, but I was like, yeah, I kind of outgrown it, I guess. And I want more from it, especially how it relates to queer and trans life, really. I think for myself, for my research, it's important because obviously I'm researching queer trans history, and there's already that kind of idea in queer trans studies, about thinking beyond the nuclear family, etc. And also, I guess, in Marxist feminism as well. That's already an idea. And then finally, I guess the other thing that it really kind of highlighted for me, which I want more of, is kind of how perhaps this sort of love isn't attainable yet completely at all times, right? Because we still have this spectre of individualism, and really what I'm saying is capitalism.
Yeah, I came across this book just now. So when I was reading it, I was like, this is nice, but it's not going to be as impactful because, I wish I would have read it when I was younger. I turned 30 in November. I've lived a bit of a life. I've moved about. I'm doing the therapy. I'm doing all the things that need to be done. So when I started reading, and like I only did the chapters that we were assigned because I procrastinated and now I need to write my chapter. So I only did the reading. There were certain points where I was like, yeah, and then like the momentum really slowed down to a pace where I don't think is very relevant to where I am now, especially with a lot of the language and how language was used. There were points, like you said, the use of love as a verb was really enlightening and wonderful to read, but it was also the very post-therapy cadence to a lot of the chapters, where I can see where this is extremely important at certain points of your life, not just age, but like I think mentality. And I can also see the like this coming out 99, 2000, whichever date we decide upon. I can see where this is very culturally significant because this is also the time of sort of ending that like girl power pastiche 90s feminism and making it into something that didn't look like a girl in a Claire's jacket, but instead something that an actual woman can grow into. So reading this right now, I'm not like I'm grown, but it's sort of I've outgrown this stage of my life and I've already done a lot of work on my own self, reflecting on my own community as well. So I was reading this and I was like, this is a little bit past me, but I'm actually going to buy a Spanish copy for my grandma because I feel like she would actually need this book. She doesn't speak English. She's not going to hear this. But, you know, she had very turbulent relationships and her second husband passed away. So she's sort of in a stage of grief right now. And I feel like this book, while she, you know, she's a lot older than me, she's 80, she will find things, especially from Bell Hooks' voice, that would be extremely relevant to her situation now.
Yeah, I think for me that really speaks a lot to like the question, who is the book for? Because I think it's very important to like question and interrogate that, like who is this for, who's reading this? Because I think for people like us, for example, and I think even like with myself, the more I grow in my quote unquote academic journey and understanding queer theory and all of these and feminist theory and all of these things like that actually underlyingly evoke love in their politics, and they evoke, I think, even more progressive understandings of love. It's like it's very easy to very quickly grow past that, but not to necessarily throw this book out and say, oh, it's not enough, but understanding, okay, it's probably just not for us. And also, it's not for us in this current time and space, right? And I think that's what's very important, because there was once upon a time where it was for us and it was very useful in our understanding and our learning and all of that stuff. But it's like right now, it's no longer for us, but doesn't mean it's no longer useful, which is why I really appreciate the idea of like buying it for your grandmother. I'll see if there's a Yoruba version for my mum. I don't think there will be, but
yeah, it's really interesting to hear how everybody's almost like progressed. It's nice, actually. It's nice to be like, okay, I'm not at a point where I'm going through turmoil. You know what I mean?
We healed.
Yeah, we're healed.
we healed. Yeah, absolutely.
We healed. We healed.
And I love that for us, right?
I love that for us.
I'm on like the antibiotics of healing process. It's still ongoing.
I think we need to put an ing at the end, so we're healing.
Yeah, we're healing.
Yeah.
You're always healing. You're always healing.
Yeah,
Always
exactly.
healing.
With that, shall we delve into chapter 1? Essentially, this first chapter is just Hook's kind of outlining this idea of love as a verb. So love as something active, that's something that you do, something that you work on. And she compares it to this idea of falling in love, which seems more passive and random and that kind of stuff. And that's kind of love as a noun. So she's trying to move away from that. And then starting to talk about, because the second chapter goes more into family, but it's also talking a little bit about familial relationships. And an important point I think she also brings up in this chapter is that love and abuse cannot coexist. Basically, she says on page 6, abuse and neglect are by definition the opposites of nurturance and care. So that's the kind of overview of the chapter.
I think the quote on the page before would be a good way to start going into the actual analysis, because I felt like this was sort of the thesis statement, which is, quote, "To truly love, we must learn to mix various ingredients: care, affection, recognition, respect, commitment, and trust, as well as honest and open communication," which I think is the general thesis statement of the entire book.
Yes, exactly. That statement, and also M. Scott Peck's definition of love from The Road Less Travelled, which Bell Hooks uses. It's on page 4. The will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. So this idea of your own spiritual growth being interdependent, she uses the term interdependent in the text, with nurturing others' spiritual growth is central to the book.
Sue, I remember, so in our previous conversation when we first discussed the book, you spoke about how this is a very like aspirational view of love, and you also spoke a little bit about materialism. So I don't know if you want to jump on that.
I mean, this comes from a lot of different points of the book. So actually, in the first chapter, that's not where my my argument didn't come in there. I'm happy to read an aspirational chapter, right? Because it's like, here's the benchmark. This is what we're aiming for. It's when, for instance, she then later on in the book, she even has a chapter on consumerism, which is basically just consumerism, which there was an opportunity there to really talk about capitalism. I mean, and she does, but to also talk about that it isn't as stratified as if whether you're poor or if you're rich. The fact that capitalism is also, I guess, this mindset affects the psyche and how we relate to one another, how we are kind of these atomized individuals, right? And I thought she could have explored that. When I read the first chapter, I was completely on board with it. And this idea of this kind of aspirational love, thinking about love as an action and a feeling. And I liked that she grounded us in that mix of ingredients. And I think the aspirational also comes from the fact that she centers a more capacious definition of spirituality. Because, of course, Bell Hooks was a person of faith. You know, she delved into Buddhism. She grew up Christian. She was Christian. But she says that, of course, and I quote, "An individual does not need to be a believer in a religion to embrace the idea that there is an emanating principle in the self, a life force, some of us call it a soul, that when nurtured enhances our capacity to be more fully self-actualized." And that's on page 13. And I think it's that idea of self-actualization, which she uses in Teaching to Transgress, this union between the mind, body, and spirit. So that's where the aspirational part comes into the text. From reading Teaching to Transgress, it seems that she was very much interested in this kind of aspiration of being, I guess, fully yourself, a sense of wholeness, and a sense of wholeness that wasn't dictated by societal conventions. It had a sort of different modus operandi, a different kind of centering is what I mean by that. And that was very much connected to the self. That's where I found that difficult, because you have to have such a level of reflexivity, I guess you would call it in the social sciences. You have to be a person who can really reflect and introspect to have that level of spirituality that isn't just focused on whether you believe in a god or not. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this idea of love as spiritual growth, because she could have just said growth, or she could have just said love as, I don't know, as a form of support.
So I was thinking about this idea of love, and like whether one of the questions I have, I guess, is whether this is like a consistent thing. But I was also going to throw to Adebayo, because I remember Adebayo a few years ago was talking about you almost like live with love. And so, you know, it's a way of doing this in your life. But Adebayo can hopefully say more about it.
Yeah, like I just to speak on Sue's what's, and I think we'll probably speak on it a little bit later when we get to like chapter 13 in regards to like the spirituality part of things. But I think absolutely there is so much about love that we can learn from spiritual practice. And I think that's something that I really do like that bell hooks does quite a bit, because I think we also learn a lot of like homophobia and like bullshit from religious practices as well. But I think there's also so much to learn, especially when you think about certain aspects and certain stories from a lot of these religious texts. And I don't just mean Christianity or Buddhism as Hooks does it, but even when you look at other religions like Islam and Hinduism and all of that stuff, like there are so many practices that really do embrace and allow you to evoke those aspects of love. So I absolutely do think that, yes, there needs to be a certain spiritual element. Not needs to, but I think it's important to have that aspect of love in what you're doing. And I think, to speak to your point, Hannah, as well, like, yeah, I think it's very important to, yeah, for lack of a better word, live with love. I don't remember saying that, but I think it's such a good quote, so I will say I said it. I'll just claim it for myself. But yeah, but like, I think it's important to live with love. But I think, like Sue, when I read the chapter for the first time, I was entirely on board. I was like, yes, absolutely, yes. But reading it again more recently, I actually was like, hold on a second. And I think it's actually might be in a part where I, like, you all might just come for my edges at this point. But it's in the part where she talks about love and abuse cannot coexist, which I agree with. I agree with that. And I think this is where, when I talk about living with love, it's about living with the complexity that love carries as well, the nuances that love carries that aren't always so sweet. And I think it's Joy James who talks about this, like, you cannot love without suffering. And I think it's looking at those intricacies of love. And I don't think Bell Hooks does this, but I think what's unfortunate is that for people who don't necessarily read the book in its entirety, or who don't necessarily engage with other texts by Bell Hooks, or engage with love in more complex ways, they might just take this away and be like, okay, that's it. My family is loveless, or my life is loveless, or I live in a loveless world, or love doesn't live around me, or whatever. And I think the point where I depart from it is where, like, dysfunction starts getting linked with abuse. And while I can understand dysfunction being a negative thing, but I think it goes back to what Sue talks about as well, in the sense that I don't think dysfunction is something that can be helped all the time. Like, especially when we all exist in a world that's very complex. We're not all perfect all the time. We're not, again, she lists these ingredients of love: care, affection, recognition, respect, commitment, and trust, as well as honest and open communication. And it's like, again, all of these need to be present for love to be present. But how much of these things do we give each other every single point of time? Does that mean that love does not then live in me? Do you get what I mean? And I think she kind of talks about the fact that, well, it kind of reads to me like she means absence of these is abuse, or absence of these means dysfunction, which is a bad thing. And I think for me, it's like, I'd say to a certain degree, I come from a dysfunctional home, but I also would say it's full of love, And I think it's been understanding the complexity of how love shows itself, and understanding how to hold grace for each other. Again, it's very easy, especially when some of these things aren't in there, like the open communication, like the honesty. It's very easy to not see each other's perspectives and understand each other. And I think that's why I say I'm constantly living in love, because I don't see myself as lacking of love, despite a lack of, for example, care sometimes, or a lack of honesty sometimes, or a lack of open communication sometimes. I still see myself wrapped in love all the time. And I think this helped because I don't know if anyone's engaged with Brene Brown's work, Daring Greatly. And she talks about this concept of good enough, right? Understanding things and beginning not from a position of lack, but from a position of being good enough. And I think I've been looking at the love around me and the love I live with in that way, not from a position of what I'm lacking, but in a position of what I do have in front of me and what I can work with. And I think that allows me to sit with that dysfunction, not necessarily abuse. So I do agree that love and abuse cannot coexist, but I think where I take a bit of a pause is where the abuse and dysfunction are basically said to be the same thing in a way.
I very much agree. So as someone that read the text later in life, I had that exact same thought. I'm like, yes, abuse, but I'm also thinking about like how cultures show affection, how cultures show all these other elements. Like, I was born in Puerto Rico, lived partly in Puerto Rico, but then I moved to the States. And the love that's expressed in the communities around me is not the same type of love that I'm receiving. And it doesn't mean that it's not love. It's just a different form of love. I was telling Hannah, there's lots of affection in Latino culture. We literally kiss each other and we hold each other's hands and we touch each other, but there's not that open communication, So that doesn't mean the community is laced with abuse in that way or in that definition, but it's just different displays ways of love, and sometimes location and all these things don't translate, and it doesn't mean that it's less or more, it's just different. So I think your point was much more erudite and lovely, but going beyond the self, but also looking at community and how communities interact with each other and how these different forms of love exist.
Also, like how we define abuse, because I think like this was coming up very recently, like the HRification of relationships, and how like I don't know if anyone's seen like articles on that, but I think it's very important to be mindful in regards to how we define and how we understand some emotions and situations that we're going through in ways that allow us to hold each other accountable while still leaving space for forgiveness, you know. And I think again Bell Hooks talks about this, but much later in the chapter. And I think it's very easy to read this part and just be like, oh, my family was dysfunctional because they did not show me this part of what Bell Hooks says love is. And so that means I'm going to cut them all off.
Yeah, I think I'm agreeing with this kind of line of conversation in the sense that we need to complicate abuse. And we're currently in a culture where there are a lot of therapeutic terms that are used that aren't always contextualized. So even though this language is helpful, and then some people don't have access to that type of therapy, etc. And there's so many different self-help Instagram accounts, for instance, and they all say different things, but they use the same terms. So I can understand where the kind of, I guess, dilution of these terms come from. But yes, it is very important to kind of think about the specificity of language. And I was just going to add that I think Bell Hooks can often be in this text quite didactic, where she's kind of just focusing on kind of teaching us or kind of speaking to us in a way and saying that this is how things should be, as in, you know, love and care are different. Like that's a very big thesis of hers, that we should think about the difference between love and care. And when I read that literally, that snatched my edges. I was like, oh, like how many times people just show me care, but have they really loved me? I think that caught everyone, that made people pause. A lot of people pause. I'm in my feels. Because she says, and I don't think it's actually in this part of the text, it's later on, but she says, when you're young, you learn care quite early on because your parents or your caregivers are supposed to show you care, they keep you alive, etc. And I think I kind of just saw that as the same as love. I'm not going to lie. So when she separated the two, I was like, so what is love? Like, it spun me. It definitely spun me. So yeah, that's actually quite a sad thing to realize, actually. That made me really sad.
Same.
Yeah. There's just so many instances where like, and then maybe you might experience care, but in that moment or that person or that relationship, it actually isn't serving you, right? And that's hard. That's really hard, because I think you want to feel like people are caring for you, like you have support. You don't want to feel like you are just on your own. So it's nice. It's something that it like triggers something in your head or a feeling. At least it does for me. But with that in mind, I was also, just to go back to my critique or my kind of call for more materialism, I think that's where this kind of conversation about abuse and love can't coexist, etc. Because what if, like, you haven't grown up in a loving environment and you're just trying to do the best you can? Like, do you just rob people of their intentions? And yes, of course, it's important to highlight that just because you have this intention, it doesn't mean that your behavior is carrying through with that intention. But I think it's definitely much more complex. I think that in a society, like what kind of images, and Bell Hooks is all about controlling images, what sort of images are shown to you, right? About like how you relate to each other, like with even just the family as a concept, you know, the fact that a parent's supposed to be kind of almost a disciplinary force, etc. That setup of the family in itself, like, can easily lead to a kind of abuse of power. I think that is what Bell Hooks is speaking to, but she's just taken quite, I think for me, quite a didactic approach, which then leaves you with kind of, in that regard, less nuance. For someone who is such a nuanced theorist and really is inculcated in popular culture, that kind of conceit in the first chapter, it is hard. It hits home.
I think even especially as queer people, there's so much complexities with how we exist in community spaces with our friends, with our families, with people that don't understand just what and who we are, right? So it's always very important to kind of have that grace and nuance when we're having these conversations about, you know, how it means to be accepted, what it means to be loved, what it means to be spoken to and about. And again, yeah, and I think often those nuances can be lost in spaces like this. And I think that's why I better conceptualize this book as a starting point in understanding love. As like, this is where I begin my journey of understanding what love is and what love means. And then when I'm done with this book, I pick up another one that helps me flesh it out even better.
Yeah, what you've all been saying also makes me think about two things, I guess. One is that this conceptualization of abuse can never be love, but then she later talks a lot about forgiveness. But then if you're forgiving, okay, let me put it this way. I've been going through it this past year, and I'm not at the point of forgiveness. I don't know if I will ever be in my whole life. Like, it's too deep of a wound. And maybe that makes me not, maybe that makes me not capable of love in the way Hooks is presenting it. But I wonder, like, if I was living my life through Hooks's conceptualization, I guess, would I go out of my way to forgive people that have done me active harm or that have abused me in a way? You know what I mean? Like, where does forgiveness lie? You know what I mean? So it looks like it was deep.
Well, forgiveness would have to come out from actual sincerity and a point in which, like, forgiveness is not something you can just give, it's something that you have to believe in first. And in that, I feel, maybe because I haven't read the entire book, but I feel like that's where forgiveness, for like how Hooks puts it, doesn't really feel very defined. It doesn't really have a body. It kind of fluctuates throughout the text because forgiveness is something that you have to first give yourself before you give to another person.
I think it's hard as well when it's connected to difficult, I guess, conceptualizations of self, especially in a neoliberal space. Yeah, like there's loads of stuff that's like, oh, if you care about yourself, you wouldn't do X, Y, and Z. You wouldn't forgive this person. You won't let this person back into your life. You know, these narratives are about a lot. And there's an album I've been listening to, and it ends at this point of forgiveness and forgiving horrendous abuse that this person has been through. And I was like, I just don't think I'll get there. But the other thing I wanted to say is this role of therapy and the self-help genre in Hux's ideas about love, right? So Hooks has clearly been through a lot of therapy and read a lot of self-help books, but also it seems like you can't get to where Hooks is unless you've been through this kind of therapy, or unless you've taken this time to connect with and deal with the self. And I think that's what you're kind of talking about, Adebayo, when you talk about like this HRification of relationships, because I've also seen this stuff, right? You can almost get to this point where you become so therapized that you want to do that to other people because you want other people to meet you where you're at. It feels like Hooks wants us to meet her where she's at, but you can't necessarily. You might not have access to this kind of stuff, this kind of therapy, this kind of self-help, this kind of space and time to think about yourself. Anyway, yeah. We had a few technical difficulties, but we're just coming back. So if the tone is slightly different, we've gone from very intense to confused. That's why. But Adebayo, you had something to add on.
Yeah, no, because in regards to what you were talking about with forgiveness, like I think I really felt that. And I think that's also why it's really important that we like differentiate dysfunction and abuse, because it really does allow us to understand what forgiveness means in certain contexts and what it doesn't mean in other contexts. You know, there are some times where it's just like you don't owe them forgiveness. And I think also forgiveness is, like I think Paula said as well, like it's this journey that you have to have with yourself. It's never really about these other people always necessarily, right? But also forgiveness doesn't mean they have to be in your life. And I think that's also another aspect of forgiveness that I think Bell Hooks doesn't really explore quite intricately. You know, I can also forgive you and recognize the fact that you're not the best for me in this current space and time that I'm in. It doesn't mean I haven't forgiven you. It doesn't mean I don't wish you peace. I wish you love and all of that stuff. And so, and I think in that aspect, it allows all of these different aspects to coexist in the sense that I can forgive you, recognize what you've done, acknowledge what you've done, forgive it, but also still recognize that you're not good for me, which is also fine. And I think kind of some of these details are lost. But again, like it's a book. I don't think it's supposed to cover all of these things, which goes back to the whole point of it's a starting point.
I just wanted to like finish our discussion of chapter 1 by talking about heteronormative love and gendered theory. So heteronormativity, we've briefly outlined it in a few episodes, but it's this assumption that everybody and everything is straight. So it's all straight coded, I guess. And I also, in this discussion of heteronormativity, I think it's interesting to think about how Hooks approaches men and masculinity, not in this chapter, but in the introduction. I think a quote that sums up Hooks's approach to men is, quote, "Men theorize about love, but women are more often love's practitioners," end quote. So I think it's also interesting to point out that about, depending on what year this came out, 4 or 5 years after this, Hooks also starts to write a lot about masculinity and love. And there's a book called The Will to Change, but there's also other books that come out. So I think Hooks develops her thinking on men and love. But yeah, just throwing it out there, whoever wants to pick it up.
I think one of my critiques of the book is that she tends to almost romanticize women's capacity to provide love and care. How does that work? For me, that doesn't work. As someone who's queer, who lives in I was thinking about my queer trans community. I was like, what? I was like, what? She has another section later on where she talks about her mother, and then she's in her mother as this image. How you're saying exceptional femininity. Yes, exactly. And almost kind of vilifies men or prescribes that there's some sort of barrier to them being able to partake in practices of love that women are perhaps more instinctually able to do, which to me I felt like it was almost undermining her central conceit, which was to challenge the idea that love is merely instinctual and that it's an action and it's a verb and it's this conscious kind of process. The other part I would just say to that, this kind of binary idea of love and gender relations is set from the obvious, where then I just think, well, what about where there's lovelessness or there's like a loveless queer relationship, right? Or, you know, a non-heterosexual relationship. That seems kind of odd to me. How would that work? Her kind of framework in that sense. Obviously, you can take from it and adapt it. The other issue I had with it was this kind of biological determinism that was at the heart of her writing. It didn't sit well with me, especially as someone who was an anti-racist. The other issue with it is also you're kind of individualizing patriarchy and sexism, etc. So yes, there's patriarchal thinking. Everyone can be kind of an agent of patriarchy, right? So I thought that was also strange to me, and also counter to what I was imagining from Bell Hooks, because she's written earlier about how white feminism can almost reinforce patriarchy. So I was like, Belle, come on, you know better.
It felt like in certain parts of this entire book, she was reiterating that like 90s self-help, like men are from Mars, women from Venus, sort of very stereotypical conversations that were happening, particularly in the West and in the United States. Also, with the rise of the evangelical South during this time period. So it was sort of like reiterating these like gendered roles and like, well, you can't expect men to do anything. And it felt very sitcom-y. It felt very Americana in a way that it wasn't progressive. And it was, I think, what made me not sit right with the conversation around men in this book.
I was also going to say, like, you can't even boil it down to being a product of its time, because at that time we already had very fleshed out queer theory that Bell Hooks was a part of. Like, the conversation that she was very much like kind of already starting to be in those conversations about queer theory and queerness and all that stuff. So, and this I've actually always thought from day one reading the book. I was like, wait, well, now why am I in it? Like, and it was just very, it was just.
Has anybody read like her later books on masculinity? I haven't actually read them.
I've low-key read The Will to Change. I think it's an alright book, again, as a starting point. So, in regards to understanding masculinity, because I read it recently when I wrote an article on my parents. So, I was kind of understanding my dad's journey with love and him kind of expressing this really amazing display of love to my mum because my mum's sick at the moment. So I just kind of like engaged with the text in that context because I do think to a certain degree it does have a lot to say about kind of being the love we want to experience and being the love we want to see. So I think the way I kind of wrote it was in a context of my mum being loving created a loving person to love her. And I think in that way, that text kind of allowed me to engage with that because, again, when we look at love and understand love as a verb, right? I think it also sees love as this thing that isn't always like you shouldn't give out love to get love back. Like that shouldn't be why you love. But oftentimes what it means is that you give love. And I think that's how self-love works, right? Even in regards to like you being able to give love to other people allows you to understand your capacity to love and be loved. And I think in that aspect and her understanding of masculinity, I really liked that part. There are some parts again where I was just like, I think there are useful theories, again, that can be applicable in multiple ways. I think reducing it to just an expression of masculinity and drawing this binary, I think that's where some of the issues lie.
If we move on to chapter 4, to think about commitment, let love be love in me. So this whole chapter is basically about self-love. And, you know, one of the key quotes from this chapter happens on page 54. Self-love cannot flourish in isolation. It is no easy task to be self-loving. And I think another important part of self-love, she essentially says that if you love yourself, you won't look for other people to fill that gap within you, essentially, which I think is an interesting point. And then the other kind of half of this chapter is talking about love in its relation to work and doing work you love. And yeah, so that's the overview of that chapter.
She also, like Loki says, do work you don't love to know that you don't love it, so you can then do work you do love.
Yeah,
like, girl, what do you say?
Yeah. Should we start with the discussion of work? Because I know, Sue, you had some connections from the last chapter to now.
I think it comes back to the idea of kind of, I mean, there are two different ideas. What I was having with the first chapter. The first chapter I was just thinking about the fact, and this isn't developed, is just thinking about that for some people, it may be easier, there's more space in your life to work on yourself and to think about the gaps in a loving environment, or you can access resources. If you have money, if you can pay for therapy, you have access to certain resources and you have that time to really think about your life. She says, to cultivate a sense of well-being, you should, or we shouldn't say should, it would be helpful to work as hard as you can at your job, or to feel like you have done your job properly, feel like you've done, yes, 10 out of 10, gold star, because that will help you with your self-esteem. Because she says self-esteem is a very key tenet of this idea of self-love. And I found that quite strange, because bell hooks is influenced by Marxism. And I was thinking to myself, the wage relationship of work, just like classical Marxism, that's exploitation. I was so confused by that. And I was thinking to myself, perhaps this is a nice kind of adage or kind of like platitude to tell myself if I'm doing a job that I don't want to do. Be like, at least I can feel good that I've done a job well done. But you know what? Like, when I read that, I thought, you know what, Belle? It sounds like to me, because we were just talking about working in, I think, a kitchen, and she was working there so she could write late at night. I was like, you know what? I see where that comes from. I understand from your biography. And I think an important part I should have mentioned or centered in my introduction to the text is that a lot of this book interweaves personal anecdotes. It's almost like autoethnography. It's about her life, her experiences, right? And it's influenced by her life also as a writer and scholar. So she's bringing in different parts of theory. Maybe she's not naming some of it. And then she's also drawn on these psychological texts and self-help books and drawing on Christianity and Buddhism. So I'm going to put that into context, but I couldn't move past that.
Yeah, I think Adebayo, you have your hand up.
Oh, sorry, I had my hand up from earlier because I think I was talking about it when you're talking about the materiality, the material analysis of this chapter, right? And I think one thing that like rereading this chapter really spoke to me was this idea of like, you can't self-love your way out of institutional violence, right? Like you can't self-love your way out of institutional systems. Like I can love myself from now till thy kingdom come, right? The world will remind me why I shouldn't. In many ways than one, either through the law, through how I exist, through how I walk, through, again, like just different interactions that I have with people, you're constantly reminded. And a very good example I like to use for this is, the body positivity moment that we're in at the moment. There's this idea of like, oh yeah, you need to love yourself, you need to accept yourself. But it's like, okay, I love and I accept myself, but what does that mean when I have to buy 2 plane tickets just because I'm like on the bigger side? Like, if we can have these conversations simultaneously, and I think it's important that we include that in our analysis of self-love. I think going back to even our analysis of work, right? Like, what does it mean to do my job well when we live in an ableist society that kind of, again, requires me to do these things that my body physically does not want to do or cannot do, or my brain wants to do or cannot do. So yeah, like, I think it's like these analyses are very important. But again, and I think this is where I take a bit of a pause with critiquing this book, isn't necessarily like, I don't think a lot of what we've said now sits in opposition to the book. I think it just sits in like fleshing out and deepening the book. So like, I don't want people listening to this to listen to it as a point of like, oh, all we've done is like critique Bell Hooks' work the whole time. Like, absolutely not. Like, what we're saying is that it's actually a really great book, but we can push it even further, right? Which is kind of what we want to do. Like, the book was written, 24 years ago now, between 23 and 24. Right? Like, that is a full-grown adult that's married, probably with a child. It's like, that's a whole generation that has happened, right? And I think right now we can move these conversations further without painting this book as this like bad negative thing, but saying, yeah, like, let's understand how we can push it. And I think that's kind of where I'm at.
What I did appreciate about the chapter, Hooks is pushing me to really move inwards. And I think when you're living in our society and you're thinking about lack, that we're living in a place of lack. And she ends the chapter with, or towards the end of the chapter, she's arguing that self-love can help us practice love from, and I quote, a place of fulfillment, not from a place of lack. And I think I also read her idea of work, and this idea of well-being is also saying that, yeah, we all have to work, but what can you do? Like, how are there ways? Like, she found this way of trying to find a positive place, a nurturing space within that world while she was writing, and she was doing another job that wasn't connected to her passion. And finally, I think that links very well. So that concept of work there, when she described her personal experience, because clearly she wanted to be a writer, right? She didn't want to work in customer service, right? Or the food industry, etc. She wanted to be a writer. She was staying up in the day writing after working at night. And I thought it was beautiful that she shared that experience. Is when she talks about solitude and the fact that we really need to learn how to be with ourselves, enjoy our own company, so that we don't see company or being with other people as a way to kind of take from them. Instead, she argues, and she uses the word fellowship, that, if we have this kind of process of self-love, then we can be in fellowship with others, where we see this connection as a form of servicing one another. So that, I think, is a very central idea from the chapter. And then the chapter, of course, begins with, if you do not love yourself, you will be unable to love anyone else. And I think she's gently challenging that or complicating that idea, because yes, maybe intuitively we do think about that's important, because then she ends the chapter with the phrase or a maxim, an ultimate kind of statement, like a truth statement. And she says, do not expect to receive the love from someone else you do not give yourself.
No, I love that. And I think that even also speaks to, like, Hannah's just brought up a quote where, Hooks does talk about the fact that, taking responsibility and I guess being more looking into yourself, like Sue's just said, does not negate the act and reality of institutionalized injustice. And I think there's definitely space to be able to sit with both. And I think that's where we all kind of lie, I guess, at this point. And I really enjoyed this chapter because I think this chapter was very instrumental in my own growth. And I think precisely because of what Sue mentioned in regards to like looking inwards and seeing yourself, just to bring up a few quotes from what she said. She was like, what about if you can't love yourself? How in the hell are you going to love somebody else? Because I don't think RuPaul read Bell Hooks.
I was thinking that the entire time.
Yeah, sorry. Another quote that I wanted to read out was, when we can see ourselves as we truly are and accept ourselves, we build the necessary foundation for self-love. I loved that part because I think it really goes back to being able to see yourself, flaws and all, right? And still love yourself regardless. Because I think it's very easy to be like, the only way to love yourself is when you see yourself as beautiful, see yourself as smart, see yourself as all of these things. But it's like, actually, you also need to love yourself within the flaws that you also possess, like understanding how you can truly love and accept yourself even despite all of these flaws that you carry. This next quote buys into like the whole binary male versus female and all that stuff, but where she talks about sexist socialization teaches females that self-assertiveness is a threat to femininity. Accepting this faulty logic lays the groundwork for low self-esteem. And I think taking out that idea of self-assertiveness being a threat to femininity, absolutely. But I think now we exist in a society where self-assertiveness is generally a threat. But again, particularly to femininity and to women and queer folks and stuff. But again, you do find that generally we don't like people being assertive in their love for themselves. And it goes back to the, oh, you need to be humble. And honestly, in 2023, I'm in my no humble era. Like, I refuse to be humble anymore. And I'm only 10% joking. Like, I'm not even, like, for real. Like, I refuse to be humble anymore, especially with things that I just know about myself and things I'm confident about in myself. And I should be able to say it. And it shouldn't have to take anything away from you as a person. And I think that in itself is a part of self-love, right? The able for me to assert and affirm myself without needing for external approval. Because it's like, I can't just walk into a room and talk about how beautiful I look. Like, oh my goodness, I look amazing today. It's like, oh, but you should wait for someone to tell you. Or when someone tells you you look good, you have to say thank you. No, I'm going to tell you I know, because I do. Like, you tell me, oh my goodness, Adebayo, you're dressed nice today. I know. Thank you. But I know. I wouldn't leave my house. I have a mirror. I looked in it. And when I looked in it, I said, you look fine enough to go outside today. So if you tell me I look good, I mean, I'm grateful that you are choosing to acknowledge my beauty. Thank you. But I don't need you to, right? Because I've already done that for myself. And I think it goes back to the idea that, so when you do it for me, I'm grateful. But I know. I'm allowed to know. I should be allowed to know. And I think it's like in so many aspects as well, be it intelligence. Like, I should be allowed to say I'm smart. I should be allowed to think that and say it. And I should be allowed to have the confidence. And I think a lot of these lay the groundwork for self-love, because oftentimes I feel like there's a lot of fear and shame attached to loving yourself, because of how we expect people to respond to that. Because it's like, oh, but you know, I don't want people to think I'm proud or arrogant or what. And it's like, look, I've really found, I don't know if anyone's seen this TikTok or this like Instagram reel where they talk about like, oh, I'm not intimidating, you're intimidated. And I absolutely love that so much, because it's true. Like, oftentimes I'm not the one being intimidating. Like, a lot of these things are a product of how people see themselves and not necessarily how you see yourself.
I was going to follow up your comment with something that she didn't say explicitly, but it was very heavily implied, was self-love is also investment in the self. So the entire time she's talking about like, I'm doing all these things to like support the work I actually love. That is financially incentivizing yourself to trust yourself and to trust that you're able to do these things, whether it is work fulfillment or something being fulfilled within you. It is labor. It is time. It is something that you sit down and decide to do for yourself. And if others receive it, great. If others don't, also great. And yeah, that fulfillment is not just like material, it's just fulfillment for the self. So I felt a little odd about this chapter. I wasn't totally in love with it, but I think through this discussion, I have learned to really like this chapter, because I think I focused on like, maybe it's because I was tired, but I was a little bit focused on sort of the nitty gritty, where I didn't like just look at the macro argument, which is her vision of self-love. And I think I was mixing it up with the therapized, like commodified hashtag self-love, which this is definitely not. But now I see the value of this chapter. So I like to say that I was wrong.
I hear that completely. And I think one thing that reading this book as a starting point did for me as well is this idea of understanding emotions that guide and impede my self-love for myself. I don't think we all do this enough, actually, in regards to sitting with various emotions that we feel. And one tool that really helped me, and I don't know if anyone's engaged with this before, is the Enneagram. I don't know if anyone's heard about this before. So it's a sort of personality test. And it really does help to, I guess, unleash and unravel a lot of your trauma, but also your emotional being. And I think for me, discovering the Enneagram, I discovered the Enneagram actually before I read this book, but marrying the two allowed me to really understand what was impeding my own access to self-love. So it's like a cycle of 9 personality types. You fall under one of the 9. And it's really complex actually, because you can be in between, but you can also be multiple personality types. When you're weak, you're in one. When you're in your position of strength, you're another personality type. But each personality type is guided by one of 3 emotions, which is fear, anger, or shame. And it's been really, really interesting understanding like which one guides you and which one you are. And so, for example, for me, I'm really guided by shame. So engaging with theories of shame, understanding shame, what shame means, what shame meant for me, how to navigate shame, it has been so transformative in regards to self-love, because what that allowed me to do is really put into practice a lot of what Hooks was talking about. And you get to see that as well, because it's like, okay, what's stopping you from being able to access the self? What's stopping you from being able to access, again, what Sue was talking about? And I think for me, it was shame. And it took understanding what shame meant to me and how to navigate that for me to really be able to access that self-love. Because again, going back to what I'm talking about, self-assertiveness, I wasn't scared to assert myself. I wasn't asserting myself out of anger. I was ashamed to assert myself, mainly because the shame was coming from, oh, but what if people don't actually see me that way? And I'm just out here feeling delusional. I was embarrassed to be delusional. But it's like, now I just don't care, And what it also really does, Enneagram, it helps you understand your relationship with other people and other personality types and where that falls in. It absolutely changed my life. Absolutely changed my life. And it has a song as well. Like there's a song for each personality type by Sleeping at Last. I don't know if you guys know Sleeping at Last. They're amazing. But yeah, like it's really, really good. Like this was helpful because again, I read Brene Brown's Daring Greatly after reading Bell Hooks' Is All About Love. So it was just a perfect continuation. Brene Brown really deals in shame. She calls herself a shame researcher. So she's someone who really does that. And when you discover what personality type you are, so I think 2, 3, and 4 are guided by shame, 5, 6, and 7 by fear, 8, 9, and then 1, so it goes back again in a cycle, are guided by anger. So again, like understanding these different emotions allow you to really understand what it is that's, stopping you from experiencing these things. And also it really connects back to your relationships with people, because Enneagram's so amazing in regards to helping you understand other people's personality types as well, and understand why you might clash with people a bit, because when you understand yourself, you understand them. And it's like, okay, now it makes sense why we always fight about this specific thing, or why me and this person don't really get along. And understanding that really also allows you to understand the next step that Hooks talks about, which is this idea that self-love cannot flourish in isolation, because it really does then allow you to really see how to avoid that isolation. And it allows you to understand how to reach out, how to, extend yourself to other people, but also understanding how you experience your feelings towards other people, And again, Hooks talks about shame a lot in All About Love as well, and how shame really does impede forgiveness. And again, like all of these things are so interconnected. And I think it would actually be very, very useful if people did their Enneagram test, figured out what personality types they are, and used the emotion that's most associated with your personality type to influence what you do. Because for a lot of us, it's fear, it's about how does fear stop you from accessing so many different emotions, different things, different actions. For some people, it's anger. How does anger do that for you? And it's about when you can understand the root of the emotion that guides you, it becomes so much easier in regards to even understanding, okay, in this space and time, why do I not love myself? What is it? And for me, it's always about something that's bringing shame to me. And even that stops me from like, maybe I really want to message my friend, but I haven't messaged them in like 2 weeks. And I'm ashamed about that. And it's like, again, that is where this whole idea of self-love not flourishing in isolation comes in, because it's a connection of everything. It now means that I'm judging myself because I feel ashamed. And then I don't reach out to my friend, which means they can't provide me with the affirmation of, oh, no, you're good. We're fine. And I'm now sitting with this self-loathing and shame that I'm like brought upon myself. And I think it's helpful. For some people, it's fear because, I'm scared because I don't know how they'll respond. I don't know what they'll say. And I think it's like navigating these have been so useful in regards to helping me understand the relationship with shame, self-love, and love with others and around others.
Yeah, I think, there's so much there. There's so much there to unpack. And also thank you for really sharing your personal reflections. I think that's always very important and can be difficult to do. Just a little thing about this isn't my broader point, but just after you were talking about that exchange about being connected to other people, you're talking about your friend, to use that example. It dovetails nicely or neatly, kind of connects to the next chapter about community and loving communion. And I think those two chapters really work together because although Bell Hooks is emphasizing that we should welcome solitude, I guess a kind of nourishing form of solitude. Chapter 8 emphasizes that where there's a lack, perhaps in the family, etc., then you can find what you're lacking elsewhere in platonic relationships, etc. So it really speaks to that idea that you need community, that we all need community to heal. And this is what speaks to me, because I said earlier about how really I'm just devastated constantly about individualism in our society. Sometimes I just feel it in my day-to-day, and then I just reflect. But then it's texts like this that pull me out of that and remind me what sort of society am I aspiring to. And this connects to the point that I was initially thinking about while Adebayo was speaking and sharing their own reflections. And that is social movements have been so important, so crucial to not only challenging macro systems of oppression, but within that, we're also kind of striving for a different relationship to the self, right? Because if we're living under oppression, then that changes how you think about yourself. And that's what Adebayo was kind of saying earlier about how you can have so much self-love, but you can live in a world that tells you quite negative images about yourself. And I'm just thinking about, being queer, being black. Even for me, from being from Southeast London, the idea of Britishness is a very pejorative view of that type of Black Britishness. I carry that still today in academia, which is a very middle class institution. And I think for me, that's where like a lot of my kind of imposter syndrome, and that where I could struggle with self-assertiveness and trying to kind of draw those kind of loving boundaries and how you relate to people in the workplace, etc. If I'm just speaking about the book in terms of myself, I was thinking about the interconnection between love and political struggle. And that's what I was trying to kind of focus on. And that comes from my own thinking as someone who is politicized and someone who is researching social movements. And I think when I'm reading the text, I see, I guess, Bell Hooks' biography or her kind of personal history in the text, right? This is where the historian comes out. So not just her interpersonal relationships with her family, etc., but when she mentions, for instance, the feminist movement, when she mentions Martin Luther King Jr. and she draws on his writing, I think it reminds me that Bell Hooks is very much a product of civil rights movement, the feminist movement, Black feminists organizing. A lot of her ideas of love are also influenced by those politics and the idea that, for instance, even in the Black Power movement, you have this idea of Black pride and that Black is beautiful, and that has been a very powerful idea. So I'm just trying to bring it back to the political, I guess, with a big P. But then I think what she does so well here is keep those kind of those radical politics, that more kind of prefigurative organizing or this like vision for a liberatory future, and bring that back to the self and thinking about self-love and what we can do. And it goes back to the kind of tension we were having about if you're living in a society that already feeds you negative images about yourself, because there are these kind of negative stereotypes determined by race, class, sexuality, gender, ability, nation, so on and so forth. What do you do with that? Like, what do you do with that? There's only a limitation. And she's speaking to working within that. You can't completely change that right now. And then that's why she has this quote about you could choose your actions and your response to this.
And that's on period.
Thank you. Thank you. Hannah, I really want to hear what you have to say.
I think, do you know that whole idea of like the personal is political? I think Bell Hooks really illustrates it in this chapter, right? Essentially, this notion of finding community. And I think you've done a really good job, Sue, of talking about community's relationship and love's relationship to activism. Like one of the quotes that really struck me happens across page 131 to 132 that says surviving and triumphing over dysfunctional nuclear families may depend on the presence of what psychoanalyst Alice Miller calls enlightened witnesses. Practically every adult who experienced unnecessary suffering in childhood has a story to tell about someone whose kindness, tenderness, and concern restored their sense of hope. this could only happen because families existed as part of larger communities. And that reminds me of, I guess, every time that I personally have been in a bad situation, it was this community and this tenderness and kindness of other people that essentially restored my sense of self. And again, when you're thinking about activism, if we think about actually connecting again back to the last chapter, Audre Lorde's original definition of self-care, essentially you care for yourself in order to be politically productive and a productive part of movement. I think it's interesting to think about the movement of love in these ways. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think it's something specifically on that point that I've been having to think about and navigate with my research. Because my research is very much on activism, right? And I think it's been very interesting understanding the place of love within activist spaces and what that means even for critiquing each other and holding each other accountable, but also in regards to how we navigate the ambivalence of activism. Because when love comes in, and I think especially when we have a very limited understanding of what love means, you know, it's like love for ourselves, love for others. It's like, oh, I love myself so much, so that means I'm going to do these things that are extremely antithetical to the activism movement. And a lot of that you have to sit with, right? Because you're like, is that love for yourself or isn't it, right? And it becomes this very complex and complicated debate when you start thinking of the place of love. And then even when it comes to like, how do we critique each other and hold each other accountable for the actions that we're doing in ways that are still loving? And I think it's very important that we, well, for me anyway, I've been starting to just infuse aspects of love, even in how I, number one, understand people's actions, because it allows you to sit with the ambivalence, right? Because sometimes our actions of love can be very antithetical, particularly when we start to think of the personal as political, because some of the things that bring me joy on a personal level can be antithetical, can be antipodes to the movement, can be antithetical to these things. And I think even this idea of a community that Bell Hooks talks about, right? It's important not to see it as this homogeneous entity and as this just big blob and a monolith, right? And I've started to use this word or this term instead of community, but instead as collective of identities, where, you know, we can all come into this space with our individual dreams, our individual ideals, our individual ways of looking at the world, our individual understandings and feelings and emotions of love, shame, anger, all of these things, and the complexities they all carry. And we can sit with it together while still understanding ourselves as individuals in this space. And I know we're talking a lot about the dangers of individualism, right? But it's also important to understand the dangers of a community that does not see each person as a person in their own right and only sees them as a part of that community, you know. And I think even that allows us to not offer each other love enough, because each person wants love in so many different ways, right? What I understand and want from someone is different from what you guys might want. And I think it's important that we all sit with that love isn't this one size fit all person. Like an expression of care, expression of trust, expression of honesty is different for different people. And I think that is kind of where I'm at in regards to grappling that individual versus community love, but also how that sits within activist spaces and our political movements.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic.
I was also thinking about how different communities express love. We've talked about that, but also loving the love you don't understand. Like, especially, you know, I'm very pale, I'm Latina, but, you know, straighten this hair out. I could pass as like Karen from Wisconsin. But knowing other communities, acknowledging all these things, and even though you cannot fully experience, or there's certain things where I'm just like, this goes over my head, it's about loving the fact that you can't just love through experience. You just have to love through the trust that this community is telling you something. And that is coming from a place of sharing and wanting to express, whether positive or negative, these interactions. And it's about loving these things and trying to do your best within it. And even if you cannot give 150%, it's about not just acknowledging, but actively loving and continuing that love in whatever way it can be expressed.
I was going to say, I guess this is kind of where the collective comes in, because it's difficult to be transformative in isolation. Like, if you have a more collective movement towards community and understanding each other, I guess it makes those transformative practices a little bit easier. If we move on to talking about then the last chapter, because we've been here a while and you as a listener won't know this, but we've had a lot of internet issues and we keep having to restart the call. So we're on the last chapter. We're going to bring this home. We got the last chapter, and unfortunately, we won't be able to do the media discussion today because me and Paula have to record another podcast after this one. And this podcast is already very long. So we will put the sources that everybody mentioned in the bio. So if you want to check out what we would have discussed, they will be there. But chapter 13, Destiny, when angels speak of love, is sort of about religion, sort of about spirituality in general. And it's also really interesting because this is the chapter that Hooks ends on. So this discussion of spirituality and love. And there's also a discussion of shame and love's relationship with shame in here, which I think is interesting. I don't know if anybody in particular wants to kick us off with discussing spirituality and love.
For me personally, a lot of the themes in this chapter are kind of things that we've discussed as we've gone on, spirituality, but also shame, very importantly. I think this chapter was really affirming for me, particularly as a Christian and a person of faith, just kind of understanding the importance of my faith with my relationship with love and shame, because I think it's very easy, particularly as a queer person, and a lot of the violence that Christianity, I don't want to say Christianity especially, but yeah, that these religious practices have kind of proliferated globally based on belief systems. It's always been really hard. And this book came at quite a good time where I was able to understand my faith as loving, as a faith that evokes love and is built fundamentally on love. And I think, again, going back to this whole thing about shame and all of that, like understanding what shame means in that context was then very helpful because the story was just so relatable. And it was something that I really understand. She told the story of Jacob. And it was, I think for me, just very, very instrumental in even marrying all of those feelings of, spirituality, shame, forgiveness, and bringing all those together and marrying it.
I think this chapter is really interesting. Like, I'm looking at some of the quotes here because I think one of the reasons Hooks ends on this chapter is because she's talking about being wounded. And if you're a wounded individual, kind of calling back to the beginning when we were talking about, if you just read that chapter, you can almost like leave it by going, I have no love in my life. I'm wounded beyond repair almost. But if you read the book all the way through and you kind of end on this chapter, she says on page 231, woundedness is not a cause for shame. It's necessary for spiritual growth and awakening. So you almost, all these things you go through throughout your life allow you to get to this space where you can love yourself and you can love other people and you can practice love. When we were talking earlier about living with love, getting to that kind of place.
Also, another part, even linking back to that, and I think living with love is something that really does allow you to see love around you, regardless of where you are. And again, this ties, I think, the whole book in nicely in regards to being able to sit with solitude and not feeling lonely, even with the woundedness and the pain and the hurt and whatever, and still understanding that love is still something that is within you and accessible to you. I really, really love this quote. She says, "The solace of knowing I could speak my heart to God and the angels made me feel less alone." And I really love that. It really does see you, like everything you need is within you. And it goes back to even this idea of spirituality, not just as, Abrahamic religions, but even going back to, a lot of indigenous. So for example, Ifa, which is something we Yorubas practice, we see ourselves as gods. So we see our own individual selves as a god, as an Orisha that we can worship. I think even when you see how that in itself is such a beautiful, beautiful ethos for self-love, because it means that you have to revere yourself. You kind of talk bad about yourself because yourself can punish you. It's kind of believed that if you say bad things about yourself and say bad things towards yourself, you can absolutely anger yourself, because yourself is a God that is able to act as a God and marshal on your behalf. So it's this idea that, even going back to the quote of Bell Hooks, which says, "The solace of knowing I could speak my heart to God and the angels made me feel less alone." This idea, when you see yourself as a God, that God isn't just, the big man up above in heaven, but even yourself, that I can speak to myself. I can speak life into myself. I can speak love into myself. I can speak the love and life that I deserve and want into my own self by myself, can allow you to feel less alone. It's been an almost out of body experience in regards to how I see myself. I think in a lot of religious systems, particularly Abrahamic religion systems, you are not allowed to see yourself as this God or this entity that is complete without an external figure, either God or the Holy Spirit or whatever. And I think it's been really instrumental in seeing this as, helping me see myself as that complete being and still loving myself despite all of that. And, being able to sit with that feeling of just self-sufficiency and self-assertiveness, and being able to own all of these aspects of myself and, proclaim myself as worthy of love, worthy of praise, worthy of reverence, and these are, again, spiritual practices that sit outside of Abrahamic religions. And I think it's one of the most important parts of even being very open in our spirituality and looking just beyond, what the Bible says and, how we're taught. Because, again, we can understand a lot of these things as very cultural and very social, and actually less spiritual as they should be. But, this allows it to bring it back to what Hooks was talking about and Sue mentioned, bringing it back to the self, bringing it back to seeing yourself as a God, being back to seeing yourself for who you are. And again, seeing yourself with the flaws and not just seeing yourself as, this, oh, I'm a reverential being and a king and a queen and a spiritual being. But no, it's like flaws and all, everything. I'm amazing and beautiful. I'm a God and I deserve reverence and I deserve love. You can give yourself that, and I think these are things that we can learn from spiritual tools.
So I used to be Catholic, Latino. I keep mentioning it, but Latino Catholicism is its own specific flavor. But there was one thing I really liked at how Mass ended. It was always, the Masses ended, now go with peace and be with God and love. And that's how it always ends. And I always thought about the word Mass and why is it called Mass? And it's because it's based off the Latin word missa, which is a mission. So at the end of the gathering, you have been given and granted the mission to continue by being in your community through peace and through love. And I thought it was a really good way to sort of tie all of this as well. I hadn't thought about this in a decade. But when I was reading through this chapter, it was a little bit odd for me, the same as with Hannah, since we're not practicing any form of religion, but the sense of spiritualness can come from the high that can be given through actually attempting to love in a way that is beyond the self.
I just wanted to talk about how the last chapter, chapter 13, its focus on spirituality and angels, very neatly sews the threads of the book. She starts with spirituality and then she ends with her connection to God, to prayer. And because I think the final chapter really kind of centers Hooks's relationship to her spirituality, and it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful to read. And she's also trying, as you said, Paola, that she's trying to show that you can have a different kind of relationship to spirituality. And before I move on to the idea of kind of, I guess, this tripartite view of the self, mind, body, and spirit, I want to draw on her final anecdote where she talks about the fact that as a young girl she would lie in her attic bed and she would pray, talk endlessly with the divine spirit about love. And then she says that during these conversations, this dialogue, and I quote, "a new vision of love came to me." She describes it as kind of this moment where she was taken on this path towards love, which I thought was beautiful. And the title of the book, of course, is all about love, new visions. And it made me think about, to what extent is she kind of drawing on the practice of kind of Bible study, and because she starts with the story of Jacob, etc. And to what extent is she kind of really recalling that practice of engaging with biblical stories and parables, etc., to ruminate and think about today or your current life. And she seems to be very influenced by Martin Luther King Jr., who of course was Christian. And I think actually something that's important to point out is the fact that Christianity is so central to the civil rights movement in the US. And of course, spirituality and Christianity is very important to think about when you're thinking about Black feminism, especially in the US. And then I think it's also just quite an optimistic note as well, which I love, or like a hopeful note that she really kind of like draws on hope, because she ends with "Love is our true destiny," which I think is a nice counter to the first chapter, which again I think she's really going like, this is the state of play in the first chapter, but she says no, but it's this unapologetic kind of like stance, it's this self-assertiveness that love is our true destiny, this community assertiveness. And finally, I think when she talks about different aspects of spirituality or different examples of spirituality that do not just involve a relationship to God or religion, I think she's reminding me of some other work in Black feminism, and she's conveying to the reader that we should really think of this self, as I said, between this union of the mind, body and spirit. And that, we shouldn't just be caught in the cerebral, in the mind, and we're all in academia. So I think that's like a real welcome like reminder. And two, like, I guess like, what do you feel in your body? So it's like different types of knowledge. But then when I say knowledge, I'm thinking like love is a form of knowledge, right? Like that practice, that action. So then if you're thinking about spirituality, and I guess, but what is this other type of spirituality? Because she mentions, for instance, right place at right time. So to me, that's kind of talking about, I guess, some things that like kind of operate on a different plane, that don't always focus on logic. They don't always focus on reason, which I think perhaps that is what she's saying. Because then Audre Lorde like challenges, for instance, the Cartesian idea of like mind-body split and focusing just on enlightenment, rational thinking.
I think the spirit is beyond the self and beyond the understanding, and spirit can be interpreted as religion, but it can also just be like literally nature. I see spirit mostly as nature and just how the world functions, how like no matter what happens, eventually things come back to its natural state. Like, war happens, things are destroyed, but then eventually things are cleaned up and restored. And that in itself is not you picking up a shovel and putting things away, but it's just how things through either time or through willingness to alter the current state. I think that in itself is a spirit. You can't touch it, but it's a sensation, it's a feeling, and it's something just beyond one's even own community. It's something, is the je ne sais quoi of it all.
And Adebayo, do you have anything to shout out before we end?
I have something to say. Everyone that's listening to this, go and do an Enneagram test. Figure out what your Enneagram type is. Yeah, like I said, 2, 3, and 4 is shame. 5, 6, and 7 is fear. 8, 9, and 1 is anger. And there's so much. Like, there's so much to explore with the Enneagram. I'm always constantly learning new things about myself, about other people, about things around me and my relationships, all of that stuff. And also, if you're someone who has identified yourself as someone who experiences a lot of shame, I think engaging with Brené Brown's work is also very, very important. Brené Brown has this amazing book called Daring Greatly, but there's a Netflix special for those of us that don't read called The Call to Courage. It's really, really good, but also just engage with Brené Brown's work if you are someone who experiences a lot of shame. She is brilliant in regards to articulating shame and navigating it.
I was just going to say, perhaps read Robin D.G. Kelly's Black Study, Black Struggle, which is what I was drawing on when I was talking about love and social movements. It's in the Boston Review, so you can access it online. And if you can get a hold of a copy of Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreams, it completely transformed my idea of historical practice. So he's kind of using the idea of kind of imagination, using historical research to explore that concept, mainly in the US, and looking at Black politics, mainly in the 20th century. And finally, I think meditation is a great thing. And I've been really enjoying meditation. And what Palin was talking about something beyond the self in nature. I feel like just practices that ground you. I think this is what this book has reminded me. Again, so it doesn't have to be meditation. I hate when people are prescriptive, or I just don't think it's helpful to always be prescriptive, but finding ways to ground yourself.
Yes, something else I forgot to mention, but I think is very, very important, but it's called Introducing Love, Gender, Sexuality, and Power. It's an article by Divya Banas, that's Deevia, and last name Bhana. Again, the title of the article is Introducing Love, Gender, Sexuality, and Power.
I think it's such a beautiful article in regards to us understanding the complexity of the existence of love amongst power dynamics. So what does love mean, for example, in interracial relationships? What does love mean in heterosexual relationships where there's a power dynamic between a man and a woman? And, what does it mean in positions of class? Can love exist in these kind of spaces where there is power and where power dynamics are? And I think it's such a beautiful article in regards to helping to see that. But also, I wrote an article for Shadow that kind of condenses that, I think, in a very little way. So Shadow Mag, that's SHADO. Once you go in, you can search my name, a bunch of articles I've written. I wrote something, it's called Masculinity, Power and Love, How We Voluntarily Defer Power Because We Love. And that engages with the idea of, again, voluntarily deferring power and how we can and should do that in the presence of love. And I use my parents as an example for that. And also I use Bell Hooks's Will to Change a little bit. So that's also keeping in theme with the with the discussion.
I just remembered one book. So while reading this text, I realised, and someone else suggested this to me when I mentioned All About Love, I want to read Communism of Love by Richard Gilman Opalski. So that's not necessarily 100% recommendation, as in I've read it myself, but it's something that I'm interested in. And I wonder what sort of ideas will come from reading those two books one after the other.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you both for joining us. I know it's been a struggle. It's been hard work. Do our final goodbyes. Okay. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.